Eleanor Caldwell stepped onto her limestone patio, the October morning crisp against her silk blouse. Her heels clicked rhythmically as she surveyed the grounds of her Virginia estate, noting where the autumn leaves had dared to scatter across her manicured lawn. Everything had its place here, and she intended to keep it that way. The outdoor lighting fixture hung crooked near the garden gate, its brass surface tarnished from years of neglect. She had called the service yesterday, irritated that such an eyesore existed on her property. Now a man knelt beneath it, his back to her, tools spread across a worn canvas tarp. "Excuse me," Eleanor called, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard immediately. The man turned, rising slowly from his crouch. He was tall, perhaps 50, with weathered hands and patient eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. His work shirt bore the evidence of his labor, dark stains across the chest, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by years of honest work. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply, his voice steady and respectful. Eleanor's gaze swept from his face to his shirt, lingering on the sweat marks and oil stains that mapped his morning's effort. A familiar smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth, the same expression that had served her well at charity galas and neighborhood association meetings. "Did your wardrobe come pre-oiled, or is that today's special touch?" The words slipped out before she could consider their weight, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to deflect her own discomfort through wit. She expected a reaction, perhaps embarrassment or defensive anger. Instead, Mason Wells simply nodded once, his expression unchanged. "Just doing the work, ma'am." He turned back to the fixture, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Eleanor stood there for a moment, something uncomfortable stirring in her chest. The joke had fallen flat, not because he hadn't understood it, but because he had chosen not to engage with her cruelty. The back door opened with a soft creak, and Donna Blake emerged, carrying a tray of coffee. At 60, Donna had been keeping Eleanor's house for 15 years. Her presence a steady constant in a life that had grown increasingly solitary since Richard's death. "Morning coffee's ready," Donna announced, setting the tray on the wrought iron table. Her dark eyes flicked between Eleanor and the working man, taking in the tension that lingered in the morning air. "Thank you, Donna." Eleanor settled into her chair, wrapping her fingers around the warm porcelain cup. "I was just commenting on our repairman's professional attire." Donna's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Man's working hard out here. Been at it since 7. "Yes. Well, presentation matters in any profession, does it?" Donna's voice carried a weight that made Eleanor glance up sharply. "Because from where I'm standing, looks like he's getting the job done." Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. It wasn't like Donna to challenge her so directly. She took a sip of coffee, using the moment to regain her composure. Through the steam rising from her cup, she watched Mason work, his movements precise and economical. He had removed the old fixture completely now, exposing the tangle of wires that had been causing the intermittent failures. His hands moved with practiced confidence, stripping wire ends and making connections that would last. There was something almost meditative about his focus, a quality that made Eleanor's earlier comment feel increasingly petty. "How long will this take?" she called out, needing to reassert some measure of control over the situation. "About another hour, ma'am. Want to make sure it's done right?" "Of course." Canyo set down her cup with more force than necessary. "I have a garden club meeting at 11, so I'll need you finished before then." Mason glanced back at her, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that brief exchange, Eleanor saw something that made her stomach tighten, not anger or resentment, but a kind of patient understanding that felt more damning than any harsh words could have been. "I'll be done in time," he said simply. Eleanor retreated into the house, the cool air of the foyer providing momentary relief from the warmth of embarrassment that had begun to creep across her skin. She busied herself with preparations for the garden club meeting, arranging flowers and polishing silver, but her attention kept drifting to the window that overlooked the garden. Mason worked steadily, pausing occasionally to wipe his brow with the hem of his stained shirt. Eleanor found herself studying the efficiency of his movements, the way he handled each tool with respect and familiarity. There was dignity in his labor that her comment had failed to acknowledge, let alone diminish. When the new fixture, finally, blazed to life, casting warm light across the garden path, Eleanor felt an unexpected surge of satisfaction. It was beautiful work, the kind that would last for years without maintenance. Mason began packing his tools with the same methodical care he had shown throughout the morning. Eleanor walked back outside, ostensibly to inspect the completed work, but really to find some way to end this encounter on better terms. The fixture gleamed against the autumn morning, its light a marked improvement over the flickering failure she had lived with for months. "It looks wonderful," she admitted, and the words came out more genuine than she had intended. Mason straightened, shouldering his tool bag. "Should give you good light for years to come." He began walking toward the gate, his work boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Eleanor stood, watching him go, something unfinished, nagging at her consciousness. The morning had begun with such clear lines, employer and worker, superior and subordinate, but those boundaries felt less certain now. "The fixture," she called after him. "It's exactly what I wanted." Mason paused at the gate, turning back, with that same patient expression. "Glad I could help, ma'am." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor alone with the steady glow of expertly installed light and the growing weight of her own words. The garden club meeting would happen as scheduled, filled with the comfortable chatter of women who shared her background and assumptions. But something had shifted in the morning air, a crack in the carefully maintained surface of her ordered world. Donna appeared beside, her coffee tray in hand. "You're not as funny as you think you are," she said quietly. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. The criticism stung because it carried the ring of truth. She had built a reputation on wit that often bordered on cruelty, using humor as both shield and sword. But standing in the warm light of Mason's careful work, her joke felt thin and meaningless. "Light is beautiful," she said instead. "Yes," Donna agreed. "It is." They stood together in the garden, the October morning settling around them like a familiar blanket. But Eleanor could not shake the image of Mason's patient eyes, or the feeling that she had revealed something about herself that was far less flattering than a stained work shirt. "Hey my Stop Racism Extra family. Thanks for tuning in. Where are you watching from? Drop your country and state in the comments. Also, what do you think of the story so far? Your feedback keeps us going. Let's hit 50 comments. Your support means everything to us. Don't forget to comment, share, and keep the positivity flowing. 3 days passed before the dining room chandelier began its death throes, flickering through dinner like a mechanical heartbeat struggling to maintain rhythm. Eleanor sat alone at the mahogany table, her meal growing cold as she stared up at the ornate fixture that had illuminated countless dinner parties during Richard's lifetime. The chandelier had been his pride, imported from Prague and installed with great ceremony 15 years ago. Now its erratic behavior felt like another reminder of how things deteriorated when left unattended, how even the most beautiful objects required care to maintain their grace. Eleanor reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the service number. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, remembering Mason's patient eyes and her own thoughtless words. Then she pressed call. "Commonwealth Electrical. This is Janet." "Yes, this is Eleanor Caldwell on Magnolia Drive. My dining room chandelier is malfunctioning, and I need someone to repair it." "Of course, Mrs. Caldwell. I can have someone out tomorrow morning. Will Mason Wells be acceptable? He's familiar with your property." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken slightly. "That would be fine." "Wonderful. He'll be there around 9. After ending the call, Eleanor sat in the wavering light, considering what she might say when Mason arrived. An apology seemed appropriate, but the words felt foreign in her mouth. She had spent decades perfecting the art of maintaining distance through humor, and genuine contrition required a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. The next morning arrived gray and humid, typical October weather that made her silk blouse cling uncomfortably to her skin. Eleanor had changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a cream-colored sweater that felt less formal than her usual attire. She told herself it was simply about comfort, not about making any particular impression. The doorbell chimed at precisely 9 o'clock. Eleanor opened the door to find Mason standing on her front steps, tool bag in one hand, a small stepladder in the other. He wore the same type of work shirt as before, this one navy blue and already showing signs of the morning's humidity. "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell. Janet said you're having trouble with your chandelier." "Yes, it's been flickering terribly. Please, come in." Eleanor led him through the foyer into the dining room, where the chandelier hung silent and dark above the polished table. Mason set down his equipment and looked up at the fixture, his expression thoughtful. "Beautiful piece," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "They don't make them like this anymore. My late husband imported it from Prague. It was his favorite room in the house." Mason glanced at her briefly, catching something in her tone that spoke of loss still keenly felt. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am." The simple condolence hit Eleanor unexpectedly. Most people who knew about Richard's death had long since stopped acknowledging it, assuming she had moved on, according to some invisible timeline of grief. But Mason's words carried a weight that suggested he understood something about loss himself. "Thank you. That's very kind." Mason began setting up his ladder, his movements careful and respectful of the formal space. Eleanor found herself studying his hands again, noting the small scars and calluses that mapped years of skilled labor. There was something honest about those hands that made her previous comment feel even more shallow in retrospect. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, surprising herself with the offer. Mason paused in his setup. "That's very thoughtful, but I don't want to put you to any trouble." "It's no trouble. I was making some anyway." She retreated to the kitchen, grateful for the familiar ritual of grinding beans and measuring water. Through the doorway, she could see Mason ascending the ladder with practiced ease, his attention focused entirely on the chandelier's complex wiring. When she returned with 2 cups, Mason had the fixture partially disassembled, delicate crystal components arranged carefully on a cloth spread across her dining table. He accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, cradling the cup in his work-worn hands. "The wiring's original," he explained, sipping the coffee appreciatively. "Probably just needs some new connections and maybe a couple of bulbs replaced." Eleanor settled into a chair at the opposite end of the table, creating what felt like a safe distance. "Do you always dress like that for work?" The question emerged before she could stop it, though this time her tone carried more curiosity than mockery. Mason looked down at his shirt, then back at her with something that might have been amusement. "When I'm doing work, yes." Seemed practical. Heat crept up Eleanor's neck as she recognized the echo of their previous encounter. "I suppose I owe you an apology for the other day. I mean, what I said about your shirt was unnecessary." Mason regarded her steadily, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Appreciate that, ma'am. Eleanor, can call me Eleanor." "All right, Eleanor." The name sounded different in his voice, more personal than the formal address she was accustomed to hearing from service providers. They sat in comfortable silence while Mason worked, the familiar sounds of careful craftsmanship filling the formal dining room. Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't expected, watching him handle each crystal element with the respect due to something both beautiful and fragile. "You have beautiful hands," she said suddenly, then felt her face burn with embarrassment at the intimate observation. Mason glanced up from his work, and for a moment, their eyes met across the table. "They do what they need to do." "I didn't mean." Eleanor struggled to find words that would explain her comment without making it worse. "I meant you handle things carefully. The chandelier, I mean. You treat it with respect. Everything deserves respect," Mason said simply. "Especially things that matter to people." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that extended beyond crystal and wire. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest. Recognition that this man possessed a kind of wisdom her social circle rarely displayed. "I don't clean up for people who look down," Mason continued, his voice quiet but firm. "Learned that lesson a long time ago." The statement landed like a physical blow, all the more powerful for its understated delivery. Eleanor set down her coffee cup, her hand trembling slightly. In 12 words, Mason had stripped away her pretenses and forced her to confront the ugly truth of her behavior. "I deserve that," she whispered. Mason climbed down from the ladder and began reassembling the chandelier with the same methodical care he had shown in taking it apart. Each crystal found its proper place. Each connection was tested and secured. Eleanor watched in fascination as order emerged from seeming chaos. beauty restored through patient skill. When the work was complete, Mason flipped the switch and the chandelier blazed to life, casting prismatic light across the dining room walls. Eleanor gasped at the transformation. The fixture seemed more brilliant than ever, its light warm and steady. "It's perfect," she breathed. Mason began packing his tools, the professional mask sliding back into place. "Should give you years of good service now." Eleanor rose from her chair, suddenly desperate not to let him leave on the same note of judgment that had colored their previous encounter. "Mason, wait." He paused in his packing, looking at her with those patient eyes that seemed to see too much. "I want you to know that I heard what you said about not cleaning up for people who look down. You were right to say it." Mason studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of her words. Then he nodded slowly. "We all have things to learn, Eleanor. Some of us just take longer than others." After he left, Eleanor sat alone in the restored light of her chandelier, feeling as if something essential had been illuminated along with the room. The conversation had stripped away layers of pretense she had worn so long they felt like skin, revealing something raw and honest underneath. She thought about Mason's words about respect, about the careful way he had handled her husband's prized chandelier, about the dignity he maintained even in the face of her casual cruelty. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt genuinely ashamed of herself, not the surface embarrassment of a social misstep, but the deep shame that comes from recognizing one's own moral failing. The light above cast dancing patterns on the walls, beautiful and complex. Like the man who had restored it to glory, Eleanor's sister Caroline arrived precisely at 5:30, her silver Mercedes pulling into the circular drive with the kind of understated elegance that announced old money without vulgarity. At 55, Caroline possessed the same sharp features as Eleanor, but where Eleanor's edges had been softened by years of solitary grief, Caroline maintained the brittle perfection of someone who had never questioned her place in the world's hierarchy. "Darling," Caroline called, air-kissing Eleanor's cheeks in the foyer. "The chandelier looks absolutely divine. Did you have it professionally cleaned? Repaired, actually?" The wiring was failing. Eleanor led her sister through to the living room, where she had arranged wine and cheese on the antique sideboard. The evening light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs that had belonged to their mother. Repaired by whom? Caroline settled into the brocade armchair that had always been her preferred seat, crossing her legs. With practiced elegance, a local electrician, very skilled work. Eleanor poured wine into crystal glasses, noting how the restored chandelier's light caught the facets of the cut crystal. She had been thinking about that light for days, remembering Mason's careful hands as he handled each delicate piece. "I do hope you're being careful about who you let into the house," Caroline continued, accepting her wine with a slight frown. "You hear such stories these days about service people taking advantage of widowed women. Mason is perfectly trustworthy." The name slipped out before Eleanor could consider whether she wanted to share it with Caroline. Her sister's eyebrows rose slightly, the way they did when she sensed gossip worth pursuing. "Mason? How charmingly familiar. And what does this Mason look like?" Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck, recognizing the trap Caroline was laying with practiced skill. Her sister had always possessed an uncanny ability to sniff out anything that might be considered scandalous, particularly if it involved Eleanor, stepping outside the boundaries of their carefully maintained social circle. "He's a perfectly respectable tradesman, Caroline. Nothing more." "Of course, darling. I wasn't suggesting otherwise." But Caroline's tone carried that particular note of amusement that indicated she was filing away this information for future use. Eleanor changed the subject to their mutual friend Margaret's recent cruise, hoping to deflect her sister's attention. They were deep in discussion about Margaret's unfortunate choice of cabin mate when the front doorbell chimed. Eleanor glanced at her watch, confused. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Caroline had already arrived. "Excuse me for just a moment," Eleanor said. Setting down her wineglass, she opened the front door to find Mason standing on her steps, tool bag in hand, his work shirt showing the day's accumulation of honest labor. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her mind struggling to process his presence in the context of Caroline's visit. "Good evening, Eleanor. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to check the chandelier connection one more time." At a couple of similar jobs this week where the fix didn't hold, and I'd rather be sure. Eleanor became acutely aware of Caroline's presence behind her, could feel her sister's curiosity radiating like heat. The moment stretched awkwardly as Eleanor tried to navigate between her desire to accommodate Mason's professionalism and her dread of Caroline's inevitable commentary. "Of course," she said finally. "Please, come in." Mason stepped into the foyer, and Eleanor noticed how he moved with careful respect for the formal space, his boots silent on the marble floor. Behind her, she heard Caroline's sharp intake of breath and knew that her sister was taking in every detail of Mason's appearance. "Mason, this is my sister Caroline." "Caroline, this is Mason Wells, the electrician I mentioned." Caroline rose from her chair with theatrical grace, extending her hand as if she were greeting visiting royalty rather than a working man. "How lovely to meet you, Mason. Eleanor was just singing your praises." Eleanor caught the subtle emphasis Caroline placed on Mason's name, the way she drew it out, as if tasting something exotic. Mason shook Caroline's hand politely, his expression neutral and professional. "Pleasure to meet you, ma'am. I'll just check the dining room quickly and be out of your way." "Oh, please don't let us interrupt your work," Caroline said, her voice dripping with a kind of false graciousness that Eleanor recognized as particularly dangerous. "We were just having a quiet evening in." Mason nodded and headed toward the dining room, leaving the sisters alone in the living room. Caroline waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Eleanor with eyes bright with malicious delight. "Well," she whispered, her voice pitched low enough to avoid being overheard, "he's certainly robust." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Caroline, please. I'm simply observing, darling, though I must say, they let anyone inside these days, don't they?" The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected, she knew Caroline well enough to anticipate such a response, but because they forced her to confront the ugly reality of the world she inhabited. These were the people she had surrounded herself with, the social circle that had shaped her assumptions and reinforced her prejudices. Eleanor found herself caught between two terrible choices. She could challenge Caroline's comment and risk an unpleasant confrontation, or she could let it pass and become complicit in the casual cruelty her sister represented. The weight of her previous interactions with Mason pressed down on her, his patient dignity serving as an uncomfortable contrast to Caroline's sneering superiority. "He's an excellent craftsman," Eleanor said carefully, trying to find middle ground that would satisfy neither her sister nor her own growing conscience. Caroline settled back into her chair with a satisfied smile. "Of course, darling. I'm sure he's very skilled with his hands." The innuendo in Caroline's voice made Eleanor's skin crawl. She picked up her wineglass with trembling fingers, using the movement to hide her disgust. In the dining room, she could hear Mason moving around quietly, the soft sounds of someone who is genuinely concerned about the quality of his work. "The chandelier has been working perfectly since he repaired it," Eleanor said, desperate to redirect the conversation towards something less toxic. "I'm sure it has. Though I do hope you're not getting too attached to his services. People like that can become quite presumptuous if you give them too much encouragement." Eleanor felt something snap inside her chest, a thin wire of patience that had been stretched too far. The casual racism in Caroline's voice, the easy assumption that Mason was somehow less worthy of basic respect, triggered a rage she hadn't felt in years. "People like what, Caroline?" Her sister looked momentarily taken aback by the sharp edge in Eleanor's voice. "Well, you know what I mean, darling. Working-class people. They sometimes misinterpret kindness as ... something more." Before Eleanor could respond, Mason appeared in the doorway, his tool bag packed and ready to leave. If he had overheard any part of their conversation, his expression gave no indication of it. "Everything looks good," he said simply. "Connections solid. You shouldn't have any more problems." Eleanor stood up quickly, eager to escort him to the door and end this humiliating encounter. "Thank you so much for checking. I really appreciate your thoroughness." "Just doing my job." Mason's eyes met hers briefly, and Eleanor thought she caught a flicker of something understanding perhaps, or sympathy. Then he nodded politely to Caroline. "Nice meeting you, ma'am." Eleanor walked him to the front door, hyper-aware of Caroline's presence behind them. On the threshold, Mason paused and looked back at her. "Have a good evening, Eleanor." The way he said her name, with quiet respect and dignity, made her throat tighten with emotion. After he left, Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his truck disappear down the tree-lined street. When she returned to the living room, Caroline was refilling her wine glass with evident satisfaction. "Well, that was interesting. He seems quite taken with you, darling. Don't be ridiculous. Oh, I recognize the signs. The way he looked at you, the familiar use of your first name. You really must be careful, Eleanor. These situations can become quite complicated if you're not firm about boundaries." Eleanor sank into her chair, feeling suddenly exhausted. The evening had taken on a surreal quality, as if she were watching herself participate in a play whose script she found increasingly distasteful. "Perhaps we should order dinner," she said, hoping to change the subject entirely. Caroline launched into a detailed critique of their usual restaurant's recent menu changes, but Eleanor found herself unable to focus on the conversation. Instead, she kept replaying the moment when Caroline had made her ugly comment, remembering her own half-smile, half-wince response. She had not defended Mason, had not challenged her sister's casual bigotry. She had simply stood there, complicit. In her silence, the dinner arrived, and they ate mechanically, Caroline chattering about social events and mutual acquaintances while Eleanor pushed food around her plate. When Caroline finally left at 9:30, Eleanor felt as if she had been holding her breath for hours, alone in her house. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing her dinner clothes. The evening replayed in her mind like a film she couldn't stop watching, each moment more uncomfortable than the last. She thought about Mason's careful politeness in the face of Caroline's obvious disdain, his professional dignity that had remained intact despite the toxic atmosphere. She thought about her own failure to speak up, the way she had let her sister's poison go unchallenged. But most of all, she thought about her own voice from days past, making that cruel joke about Mason's shirt. She realized now that she and Caroline were cut from the same cloth, shaped by the same assumptions and prejudices. The only difference was that Eleanor was beginning to see the ugliness of it, while Caroline remained comfortably blind. The chandelier cast its restored light across the ceiling above her bed, beautiful and steady. Eleanor closed her eyes and felt tears slip down her cheeks, mourning not just for Mason's dignity, but for her own lost moral compass that was only now beginning to point toward true north. 2 days of October rain had left Eleanor's house feeling like a mausoleum, the kind of damp quiet that made her think of crypts and forgotten things. She moved through rooms that had once hosted laughter and conversation, now filled only with the sound of her own footsteps on polished floors. The memory of Caroline's visit clung to the air like smoke, making everything feel tainted and small. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching water cascade from gutters that probably needed cleaning when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple and professional. "This is Mason Wells. Noticed some loose trim work on your front porch yesterday. Would you like me to fix it?" No charge should have caught it during the initial visit. She stared at the message for several minutes, remembering the careful way he had said her name at the door, the dignity he had maintained despite Caroline's obvious hostility. The offer felt like an unexpected gift, a chance to redeem herself from the cowardice she had displayed during her sister's visit. "Yes, please," she typed back. "What time works for you?" "This afternoon around 2, if that's convenient." Eleanor spent the morning in a strange state of nervous energy, changing clothes 3 times before settling on a cream cashmere sweater and dark slacks. Clothing that felt less formal than her usual attire, but still respectable, she told herself. She was simply dressing appropriately for the weather, not making any particular effort for Mason's visit. At exactly 2 o'clock, his truck pulled into her driveway. Eleanor watched from the window as he unloaded his tools, noting the careful way he arranged everything on the front lawn to avoid damaging her landscaping. When the doorbell chimed, she took a deep breath before answering. Mason stood on her front porch, tool bag in one hand, a thermos in the other. He wore a different work shirt today, green flannel that looked soft with age, and his expression carried the same patient professionalism she had come to recognize. "Good afternoon, Eleanor. Hope I'm not interrupting anything. Not at all. I appreciate you taking the time to check on this. She stepped outside to examine the trim work he indicated, noting how the recent rain had highlighted gaps where the wood had warped slightly away from the house. It wasn't a critical repair, but the kind of detail that spoke to Mason's thoroughness. I should have noticed this when I was here for the light fixture, he explained, running his fingers along the loose board. It's probably been like this for a while, but the rain makes it more obvious. Eleanor found herself studying his hands again, the way they moved with confident familiarity across the wood. There was something almost intimate about watching someone work with such focused attention, as if she were being allowed to witness a private conversation between craftsman and material. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, surprising herself. With the offer, it's gotten quite chilly. Mason looked up from his examination of the trim. "That's very thoughtful. If it's not too much trouble. Earl Grey, all right?" "Perfect." Eleanor retreated to her kitchen, grateful for the familiar ritual of heating water and preparing the tea service. Through the window, she could see Mason, setting up his tools with the same methodical care she had observed before. Everything about his approach suggested patience and respect for the work itself. When she returned with a tray holding 2 cups and a plate of shortbread cookies, Mason had already begun the repair. He accepted the tea with work-stained fingers that handled the delicate china as carefully as he handled everything else. "Your sister seemed nice," he said, after taking a sip, his tone neutral, but something in his eyes suggesting he had heard more of Caroline's commentary than he had let on. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck. Caroline can be traditional in her thinking. We all have family with strong opinions. The diplomatic response made Eleanor feel even worse about her own failure to challenge Caroline's bigotry. Mason was offering her an easy exit from the discomfort, but she found herself unwilling to take it. "She was rude," Eleanor said quietly. "What she said, the way she looked at you, it was inexcusable." Mason set down his teacup and studied her face carefully. "Appreciate you saying that. I should have said it then, when it mattered. Sometimes it takes time to find the right words." Eleanor wrapped her hands around her teacup, using the warmth to steady herself. "Did your family teach you to be so patient with people's failures?" Something flickered across Mason's face, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. "My grandmother used to say that anger is just hurt wearing a disguise. Most people who act ugly are carrying something heavy." "What about people who just stand by and let ugly things happen?" Mason resumed his work on the trim, his movements thoughtful and deliberate. "Maybe they're carrying something heavy too." The observation hit Eleanor with unexpected force. She had been so focused on judging herself for her cowardice that she had not considered what fears might have motivated her silence. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. She had been afraid of Caroline's disapproval, afraid of disrupting the social order that had defined her world for decades. "I was married for 23 years, Eleanor said suddenly, the words emerging without conscious decision. "Richard and I moved in the same circles, knew the same people. After he died, I realized how much of my identity had been tied to being his wife. Caroline and our friends, they're all I have left of that life." Mason paused in his work, giving her his full attention without making her feel exposed or judged. "Must be hard, losing someone who was such a big part of who you are." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. It had been years since anyone had acknowledged the complexity of her grief. The way Richard's death had left her questioning not just her future, but her entire sense of self. "I've been hiding behind other people's expectations for so long. I'm not sure I remember how to think for myself anymore." "Seems to me you're remembering just fine." The quiet confidence in Mason's voice made her look up sharply. He was watching her with those patient eyes, and she saw something there that looked almost like pride. "You think so? Don't know many people who'd invite a stranger to stay for tea after their sister made it clear they disapproved." Eleanor laughed, a sound that held more sadness than humor. "It's a start, I suppose." They worked together in comfortable silence, Mason repairing the trim while Eleanor held boards steady or handed him tools when needed. There was something deeply satisfying about the collaboration, the way their different skills complemented each other to create something better than either could have achieved alone. "Tell me about your military service," Eleanor said as Mason made final adjustments to the repair. "Were you deployed overseas?" Mason's hands stilled for a moment. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Navy electrician, mostly working on base infrastructure. Must have been difficult, had its moments. But I learned a lot about what really matters. He glanced at her with something that might have been vulnerability. Hard to worry about much else when you've seen what people can do to each other. Over ideas. Eleanor absorbed this information, adding it to her growing understanding of the man who had shown such patience with her family's casual cruelty. "Is that why you're so diplomatic about people's failings?" "Partly, but mostly, it's just practical. Anger doesn't fix anything, and life's too short to carry grudges." As the afternoon light began to fade, Mason packed up his tools with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. The trim work was invisible now, blending seamlessly with the rest of the porch as if it had never been damaged. "Thank you," Eleanor said, as they stood by his truck. "For the repair, for the conversation, for being patient with a foolish old woman." Mason shook his head firmly. "You're not foolish, Eleanor, and you're not old. You're just figuring some things out, same as everybody else." After his truck disappeared down the street, Eleanor remained on her front porch, running her fingers along the perfectly fitted trim work. The repair was invisible, but she could feel the difference in the smooth alignment, the solid connection that would weather future storms. Inside her house, she poured herself a glass of wine and settled into Richard's old chair by the fireplace. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The conversation with Mason had revealed possibilities she had not allowed herself to consider, that she might be capable of growth. But her failures did not have to define her future. The house felt different around her, less like a mausoleum and more like a home that was simply waiting for its next chapter to begin. Eleanor discovered the burned-out bulb on a Thursday morning while carrying coffee to Richard's old study, now her makeshift office where she managed the few remaining aspects of her estate planning business. The hallway sconce had been flickering for days, casting unreliable shadows that made her feel as if the house itself was losing its grip on stability. Standing beneath the ornate fixture with a replacement bulb in her hand, Eleanor realized she had no idea how to safely remove the old one. The sconce hung 8 feet above the marble floor, requiring a ladder she didn't own and skills she had never needed to develop. For a moment, she considered calling the electrical service and scheduling a formal appointment. But something about the bureaucratic distance of that approach felt wrong, like reverting to old patterns she was trying to leave behind. Instead, she found herself reaching for her phone and scrolling to Mason's number. The text she composed was simple. "Small favor to ask, hallway bulb burned out and I can't reach it safely. Could you help when you have a moment?" His response came within minutes. "Of course. Free this afternoon around 3, if that works." Eleanor spent the morning in unusual anticipation, finding herself glancing at the darkened sconce as if it were a countdown timer marking the hours until Mason's arrival. She changed clothes twice, finally settling on a navy sweater that felt both comfortable and appropriate. When his truck pulled into her driveway at exactly 3 o'clock, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness she couldn't quite explain. This was such a simple request, hardly worth the careful attention she had given to her appearance or the way she had arranged fresh flowers in the hallway. Mason appeared at her door, carrying a small stepladder, his expression warm and professional. Today, he wore a gray work shirt that brought out the silver threading through his dark hair, and Eleanor noticed for the first time the laugh lines around his eyes. "Afternoon, Eleanor. Which bulb is giving you trouble?" She led him to the hallway, sconce suddenly self-conscious about having called him for such a minor issue. "I feel foolish asking you here for something so simple." "Nothing foolish about knowing your limits," Mason replied, setting up his ladder with practiced efficiency. "These old fixtures can be tricky anyway. Better to be safe." He climbed the ladder with easy confidence, reaching for the ornate glass shade that protected the bulb. Eleanor found herself standing closer than necessary, ostensibly to hand him the replacement bulb, but really to study the careful way he worked. "Did your hands always look like that?" she asked suddenly, then felt her face burn with embarrassment at the intimate observation. Mason paused in his work, glancing down at her with something that might have been amusement. "What do you mean?" Lino gestured helplessly at his hands, which were removing the old bulb with gentle precision. They're so ... capable, like they know exactly what to do with everything they touch. It's the work, Mason said, his voice carrying a note of something deeper than casual conversation. It stays with you, changes you. Eleanor reached up to hand him the new bulb, and for a moment their fingers brushed in the exchange. The contact was brief and innocent, but it sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with the simple task at hand. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" she asked, needing to fill the sudden silence. "Since I got out of the Navy, about 12 years now, but I've always worked with my hands. Helps me think." The new bulb blazed to life as Mason twisted it into place, casting warm light down the hallway that seemed to illuminate more than just the space around them. Eleanor looked up at him on the ladder, noting the concentration on his face as he adjusted the glass shade to sit perfectly straight. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Should be good for another few thousand hours." As he climbed down the ladder, Eleanor found herself reluctant to step back, creating a moment of proximity that felt charged with possibility. She could smell the faint scent of sawdust on his clothes, could see the small scar on his chin that spoke of old injuries. "Thank you," she said softly, "for coming so quickly, for not making me feel foolish about calling." Mason folded his ladder, but his attention remained focused on her face. "You could never be foolish, Eleanor. You're one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met." The compliment hit her with unexpected force, partly because it felt genuine, and partly because she couldn't remember the last time someone had described her in terms of character rather than social position. "I don't feel very thoughtful most of the time. I feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark, trying to figure out who I'm supposed to be." "Maybe that's what thoughtful looks like," Mason said gently. "Most people never question whether they're being the person they want to be." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by his ability to reframe her uncertainty as something valuable rather than pathetic. They stood in the warm light of the repaired fixture, and she became aware of how close they were standing, how easy it would be to reach out and touch his arm. Instead, she took a half step back, trying to restore some semblance of appropriate distance. But her movement was awkward, and she stumbled slightly on the edge of the Persian runner that lined the hallway. Mason's hand shot out instinctively, catching her elbow to steady her. The contact was firm and warm, and for a moment they stood frozen in that position, his hand on her arm, their faces closer than they had ever been. "Careful," he said softly, but he didn't immediately release her. Eleanor looked up into his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity or professional courtesy, but genuine caring that had nothing to do with obligation or politeness. It was the look of someone who saw her not as a customer or a lonely widow, but as a woman worth protecting. "Did your hands always feel like that?" she whispered, the question emerging without conscious thought. Mason's thumb moved almost imperceptibly against her arm, a gesture so subtle it might have been accidental. "Like what?" "Like they could hold things together that were falling apart." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that extended far beyond the simple repair he had just completed. Eleanor felt exposed and vulnerable, as if she had revealed more about her emotional state than she had intended. Mason's hand lingered on her arm for another heartbeat before he gently released her. "Some things are worth holding together," he said quietly. They stood in the hallway for a long moment, both seeming to understand that something significant had just occurred, though neither was quite ready to name it. The repaired light cast steady illumination around them, creating a circle of warmth in the large, echoing house. "I should let you get back to your day," Mason said finally, though his tone suggested reluctance. "Of course. Thank you again for everything." Eleanor walked him to the door, hyper-aware of his presence beside her, the way he moved with quiet confidence through her formal spaces. On the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. "Eleanor, if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to call." The emphasis he placed on the repeated word made it clear he was offering more than professional services. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. After his truck disappeared down the street, Eleanor returned to the hallway and stood beneath the repaired light. She raised her hand and looked at her palm, still feeling the phantom warmth of Mason's touch on her arm. Her skin seemed to hold the memory of that brief contact. The way he had steadied her both physically and emotionally, she thought about his words, "Some things are worth holding together," and wondered if he had been talking about more than just her near stumble on the rug. The possibility that he might see her as someone worth caring for, worth protecting, was both thrilling and terrifying. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom, her mind replaying every moment of their interaction. The simple task of changing a light bulb had somehow become something much more complex and meaningful. A moment of connection that felt like the beginning of something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. But as she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor found herself looking forward to the next time something in her house might need repair. Eleanor had not lit a fire in the living room fireplace since the winter after Richard's death, when the task had seemed too intimately connected to memories of evenings they had shared reading in comfortable silence. The hearth had become another monument to loss, beautiful but cold, like so many other aspects of her carefully preserved life. But on this particular October evening, with rain drumming against the windows and a chill settling into the bones of the old house, Eleanor found herself kneeling on the Persian rug, arranging kindling with hands that remembered the ritual despite years of disuse. The reason for this sudden desire for warmth was not entirely clear to her. Perhaps it was the lingering memory of Mason's hand on her arm from that afternoon, the way his touch had made her feel steadied and safe. Perhaps it was simply that the house felt too large and empty for another evening of silence. She struck a match and held it to the newspaper beneath the carefully arranged logs, watching as flame caught and began to spread. The fire took hold with surprising eagerness, as if it had been waiting patiently for her to remember its value. "Well, look at that," came Donna's voice from the doorway. "Something warm in this house again." Eleanor glanced back to find her housekeeper standing with a load of fresh linens, her expression showing the kind of gentle surprise reserved for witnessing small miracles. It seemed like a good evening for a fire. Donna set down her linens and moved closer to the hearth, extending her hands toward the growing warmth. "First time I've seen this fireplace lit in 7 years. What brought this on?" Eleanor settled back on her heels, studying the dancing flames. "I'm not entirely sure. It just felt necessary tonight." Donna's sound carried worlds of understanding. Sometimes necessary is the best reason for anything. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the fire establish itself. Eleanor found herself thinking about Mason's patient hands, the way he approached every task as if it deserved his complete attention. There was something about his presence that made her want to tend to neglected things, to bring warmth back to spaces that had grown cold. "Donna, can I ask you something?" "Of course you can. Do you think I'm a good person?" Donna turned to study Eleanor's face, her dark eyes serious and searching. "That's a heavy question for a Tuesday evening. I've been thinking about some of the things I've said and done lately. The way I treated that electrician, Mason, when he first came to work here. The way I didn't speak up when Caroline was so rude to him." Eleanor poked at the fire with the brass poker, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "I used to think I was better than people like Caroline, but I'm not sure that's true anymore." Donna settled into Richard's old armchair, her expression thoughtful. "Being good isn't about being perfect, Mrs. Caldwell. It's about recognizing when you've done wrong and trying to do better. But what if the damage is already done? What if I've shown someone who I really am, and it's ugly? Then you show them who you're becoming instead." Eleanor absorbed this wisdom, feeling some of the weight lift from her chest. The fire crackled steadily now, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning oak. "I think I might be interested in someone," Eleanor said suddenly, the words emerging before she could consider their wisdom. Donna's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained neutral. "That's so. It's complicated. He's not the kind of person my social circle would approve of." "Your social circle approve of you being lonely and bitter for the rest of your life?" The blunt question made Eleanor laugh despite herself. "When you put it that way, Mrs. Caldwell, I've been keeping house for you for 15 years. I watched you and Mr. Richard together, saw how happy you could be with the right person. I also watched you these past 7 years, getting smaller and sadder, hiding behind that sharp tongue of yours." Donna leaned forward in her chair, her Voice gentle but firm. If someone's making you want to light fires again, maybe you should pay attention to that. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. What if I'm too old for this? What if I've forgotten how to be ... open to someone? Honey, the heart doesn't have an expiration date. And from where I'm sitting, yours is just starting to wake up. After Donna retired for the evening, Eleanor poured herself a glass of wine and settled into the chair opposite the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a sense of intimacy and warmth that the house had lacked for years. She thought about Mason's smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he found something genuinely amusing. She remembered the careful way he had handled her husband's chandelier, the respect he had shown for something that mattered to her. Most of all, she thought about the moment in the hallway when he had steadied her, the way his touch had made her feel protected and valued. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with that kind of caring attention, as if she were worth taking care of. Eleanor reached for her phone, scrolling to Mason's contact information. Her thumb hovered over the call button as she considered what she might say. The rationale part of her mind cataloged all the reasons why pursuing any kind of relationship with him was complicated. Their different backgrounds, the potential for social disapproval, her own rusty emotional skills. But the fire cast warm light across her face, and she could still feel the phantom touch of his hand on her arm. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake, alert to possibilities that extended beyond the narrow confines of her carefully controlled existence. She didn't call him, not yet, but she kept the phone in her lap, a talisman of potential connection, while the fire burned steadily through the evening. Outside, the rain continued its percussion against the windows, but inside, warmth spread through rooms that had been cold for too long. When Eleanor finally climbed the stairs to bed, she left the fire burning low in the grate, its gentle glow, a promise that some things, once rekindled, were worth tending carefully through the night. The house settled around her with different sounds than usual. The soft pop and hiss of burning wood, the whisper of warm air moving through rooms that had forgotten what comfort felt like. Eleanor lay in her bed, listening to these new rhythms, and allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to share this warmth with someone who understood its value. For the first time in years, she fell asleep planning for tomorrow instead of morning. Yesterday, Eleanor Caldwell adjusted the crystal water glasses on her dining room table for the third time, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as voices drifted from the living room. The monthly charity board meeting was already running longer than expected, and she could hear Mason's steady footsteps moving across the upstairs hallway as he worked on the guest bedroom outlet that had been sparking for weeks. The Henderson Foundation really should reconsider their funding priorities, came Caroline's voice from the other room, sharp and familiar in its criticism. Some of these community programs are just throwing money at problems that can't be solved. Eleanor forced a smile as she returned to her guests, settling into her usual chair at the head of the table. Board member Patricia Whitmore was mid-sentence about budget allocations when Mason appeared at the top of the staircase, tool bag in hand, making his way down with quiet precision. Patricia's eyes followed his movement, her conversation halting mid-word. She leaned toward Eleanor with the kind of conspiratorial whisper that carried exactly as intended. House help these days. My goodness, they certainly make themselves comfortable, don't they? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She watched Mason's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, saw the slight pause in his step that told her he'd heard every syllable. Her chest tightened with something she couldn't immediately name: shame, anger, protective instinct, all warring together. No, Eleanor's voice cut through the sudden silence like a blade. Someone more useful than any of us. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, closing again without sound. Caroline's eyebrows rose in surprise, while the other board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Mason continued down the stairs without looking back, but Eleanor caught the almost imperceptible nod he gave her as he passed through the foyer. The front door closed with its usual soft click, leaving behind a silence that felt both triumphant and terrifying. Well, Caroline finally managed, her voice carefully neutral. That was unexpected. Eleanor's hands were shaking now, adrenaline coursing through her system. She'd just defended a man she'd mocked only weeks ago, and the realization of how completely her perspective had shifted left her breathless. The meeting ended 20 minutes later with strained pleasantries and promises to review budget proposals via email. Eleanor walked her guests to the door, accepting awkward kisses on the cheek and murmured concerns about her outburst. She closed the door behind the last departure and leaned against it, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house felt enormous around her, every room echoing with memories of similar gatherings where she'd been complicit in casual cruelties, where her silence had been participation. She made her way to the kitchen, needing water, needing air, needing something to anchor her to this moment of clarity. Donna was loading the dishwasher, her movements efficient and knowing. She glanced up as Eleanor entered, taking in her employer's pale complexion and shaking hands. "You did good today," Donna said simply, not looking up from the wine glasses she was arranging. Eleanor's composure cracked. The tears came without warning, harsh sobs that she tried to muffle against her palm. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her carefully constructed facade finally collapsing under the weight of years of performing superiority she'd never felt. "I never know when to speak up," she managed between gasps, "until it's too late. Until I've already been complicit in something ugly." The kitchen door opened quietly, and Mason stepped inside, his tool bag set carefully by the entrance. Eleanor looked up, mortified that he was seeing her like this, makeup smeared, pride in ruins, nothing left but raw honesty. "Don't let it be too late," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd waited years for people to find their courage. She met his eyes, seeing something there she'd been too proud to notice before. Not judgment, not pity, but recognition. The acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to finally choose the right side of a moment that mattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words encompassing more than just today's defense, reaching back to cover every cruel comment, every dismissive glance, every moment The simplicity of his acceptance broke something open in Eleanor's chest. She'd expected to have to earn forgiveness, to grovel or explain or justify. Instead, it was offering her something she'd never learned: to give herself the grace to be imperfect and still worthy of kindness. "The outlet upstairs is fixed," he said after a moment, "but I can come back tomorrow if you need anything else looked at." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond electrical work. Eleanor wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling raw and exposed, but somehow more herself than she'd been in years. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'd like that." Eleanor spent the afternoon cleaning her dining room table by hand, polishing the mahogany until it gleamed like dark water. She'd dismissed Donna early, claiming she needed time alone, but the truth was more complex. Tonight required something from her that couldn't be witnessed or assisted, demanded the kind of vulnerability that only existed in empty spaces. The phone call to Mason had been brief, almost businesslike. "Would you come for dinner tonight? 7 o'clock. No explanation, no context. Just an invitation that felt heavier than any charity gala she'd ever hosted. At 6:30, she changed her outfit for the 4th time, settling finally on a simple navy dress that made no statements about status or intention. Her hands moved to her jewelry box out of habit, then stopped. Tonight wasn't about performance. The doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. Mason stood on her front steps in pressed khakis and a crisp white button-down, his work boots replaced by simple leather shoes. He'd made an effort, not for her approval, but out of respect for the occasion, and the gesture nearly undid her carefully constructed composure. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. The dining room glowed with soft lamplight, the overhead chandelier dimmed to something approaching intimacy. She'd sat 2 places at one corner of the large table, abandoning the formal distance that usually characterized her dinner parties. "Smells good," Mason said, though his voice carried a careful neutrality that suggested he was still uncertain about the evening's purpose. Eleanor had spent hours on the meal: roast chicken with herbs from her garden, vegetables that she'd actually chopped herself instead of delegating to Donna. Cooking had felt like an act of service, something she'd forgotten how to offer without expecting recognition in return. They sat across from each other, the distance between them measured and deliberate. Eleanor poured wine for herself, water for Mason without asking his preference. The small act of remembering felt monumental. "Mason," she began, then stopped, the rehearsed words dissolving in her throat. She'd practiced this conversation for hours, but sitting across from him now, everything felt inadequate. He waited, cutting his chicken with steady hands, giving her the space to find her way to honesty. "I was cruel," she said finally, the words stark in the warm room. "Not just with the comment about your shirt, with my attitude, my assumptions, the way I looked at you like you were somehow less than human." Mason set down his fork, his dark eyes meeting hers across the table. "And small," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I made myself feel bigger by trying to make you feel smaller. And that's not who I want to be." The silence stretched between them, filled with the soft clink of silverware and the distant sound of wind in the trees outside. Eleanor felt exposed. Every defense stripped away, waiting for his response, like a verdict. "You were scared," Mason said finally, his voice gentle but unflinching, "and lonely." The words hit her like absolution and accusation combined. She'd expected him to accept her apology or reject it, not to see through it to the deeper truth she'd been avoiding. "Yes," she whispered, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "I've been so lonely, I forgot how to see other people clearly. Everyone became either a threat to my image or an audience for my performance." Mason nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his expression. Loneliness can make you do things that push people further away. Makes you test whether folks will stick around even when you're at your worst. Eleanor's chest tightened with recognition. She had been testing him, prodding at his dignity to see if he'd abandon her like everyone else eventually did. The realization was devastating and liberating simultaneously. "I don't want to be that person anymore," she said, reaching for her wine glass with trembling fingers. "I don't want to hurt people because I'm afraid of being hurt." "Then don't," Mason replied simply, resuming his meal as if the solution were that straightforward. The conversation shifted gradually, moving from apology to something approaching friendship. Mason spoke about his nephew Jacob, about the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. Eleanor found herself talking about her marriage, about how she'd learned to perform contentment so well that she'd forgotten what actual happiness felt like. When Mason reached for the salt, his hand brushed against hers on the table. Neither of them pulled away immediately. Eleanor felt the roughness of his skin, the warmth of his palm, the steadiness that had drawn her attention from the beginning. It wasn't romantic exactly, but it was real in a way that made her breath catch. "This chicken is excellent," Mason said quietly, his hand still resting near hers. "I haven't cooked for someone else in years," Eleanor admitted. "I'd forgotten how different it feels when it matters." Mason's fingers moved slightly, not quite holding her hand, but acknowledging its presence. "Everything's different when it matters." The simple statement contained multitudes. Eleanor understood that they weren't just talking about dinner anymore, weren't just navigating apology and forgiveness. They were acknowledging something fragile and unprecedented growing between them. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "So am I," Mason replied, his thumb brushing across her knuckles before he finally pulled his hand away to continue eating. The rest of the meal passed in comfortable quiet, punctuated by genuine laughter and the kind of easy conversation Eleanor had forgotten was possible. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing or calculating or protecting herself from judgment. She was simply present with another human being who saw her clearly and chose to stay. Thunder rolled across Eleanor's estate like a warning, shaking the windows in their century-old frames. Rain had been falling steadily since afternoon, but by evening it had transformed into something more urgent, demanding attention with every gust of wind that sent branches scraping against the house. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, watching the lights flicker ominously overhead. The electrical system in the old colonial had always been temperamental, but storms brought out its most unpredictable behavior. She'd already called Mason twice. Once, when the power had stuttered during dinner. Again, when the lights in the front hall had gone out completely. "I can check it in the morning if the rain lets up," Mason had said during the second call, his voice crackling slightly, through what might have been interference or his own reluctance to venture out in the weather. But then the kitchen lights had failed entirely, leaving Eleanor standing in darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. The refrigerator's hum died, the coffee maker's clock went blank, and the realization hit her that she was completely alone in a house that suddenly felt vast and unwelcoming. Her third call to Mason was different. "Please," she said simply when he answered. "I know it's late. I know the weather is terrible, but I can't." She stopped, unwilling to voice her fear, to admit that the darkness was bringing back memories of the first months after Richard's death, when every shadow had felt like an ending. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Mason said, without hesitation, and the relief that flooded through Eleanor was disproportionate to the problem at hand. She heard his truck in the driveway despite the rain, saw his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he made his way to the front door. When she opened it, he was soaked through despite his rain jacket, water dripping from his beard and forming puddles on her marble foyer. "Power's out to the whole block," he said, shaking water from his jacket. "But I can check your fuse box, see if there's something I can do temporarily." Eleanor nodded, following him through the darkened house with her own flashlight, their beams dancing across familiar furniture that looked strange and imposing in the shadows. The basement felt like descending into a cave, all stone walls and the musty smell of old money and older secrets. Mason worked methodically at the electrical panel, testing connections and replacing fuses while Eleanor held the flashlight steady. She found herself studying his profile in the harsh lead light, the concentration on his face as he diagnosed problems she couldn't even identify. "This should get you some basic power back," he said, flipping switches with practiced precision, at least in the main rooms. The lights flickered back to life throughout the house, warm and golden after the stark emergency lighting. Eleanor felt her shoulders relax, tension she hadn't realized she was carrying finally releasing. They climbed back upstairs together, Mason gathering his tools while Eleanor tried to think of a way to ask him to stay without sounding pathetic or desperate. The storm was still raging outside, rain lashing against the windows with renewed fury. "The roads are getting pretty bad out there," Eleanor said carefully, watching Mason shoulder his tool bag. "All that standing water on the back roads." Mason paused at the front door, his hand on the deadbolt. "I've driven in worse." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, all her careful composure crumbling under the weight of honesty. "Stay tonight," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Just so I don't feel like I imagined all this." The admission hung between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond storm safety or road conditions. Mason turned to face her fully, his dark eyes searching her face in the restored lighting. "All what?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "This." Eleanor gestured helplessly between them. "The way you see me, the way I feel when you're here. It's the fact that for the first time in years, I'm not performing or pretending or trying to be someone I think I should be." Mason set his tool bag down slowly, water still dripping from his jacket onto her pristine floors. "You mocked my shirt," he said, his voice carrying no accusation, just acknowledgement of the distance they'd traveled. "I also want your hands to stay," Eleanor replied, the words coming from some deep place she'd forgotten existed. "I want to wake up tomorrow knowing this isn't just something I dreamed up because I was lonely." Thunder crashed overhead, punctuating her confession with dramatic timing that would have been laughable in any other context. But nothing about this moment felt like performance or pretense. It felt like the first real thing Eleanor had said in years. Mason didn't answer immediately. He stood there in her foyer, rain-soaked and steady, considering her request with the same careful attention he brought to electrical problems. Eleanor held her breath, aware that she'd just asked for something that couldn't be taken back or explained away. "The guest room upstairs has fresh sheets," she said softly, offering him an out while hoping desperately he wouldn't take it. Mason looked toward the stairs, then back at her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I'll stay." The relief that flooded through Eleanor was so intense it left her dizzy. But underneath the gratitude was something more complex, the recognition that she'd just crossed a line from which there was no retreat, and that for once in her carefully controlled life she was exactly where she wanted to be. Eleanor woke to silence, not the oppressive quiet that usually filled her house, but something softer, the peaceful hush of snow beginning to fall outside her windows, muffling the world in gentle white. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape that looked clean and full of possibility. She'd slept better than she had in months, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of what hadn't. Mason had accepted her offer of the guest room with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else, disappearing upstairs after helping her check that all the restored electricity was functioning properly. No awkward negotiations, no loaded conversations, just the simple comfort of knowing she wasn't alone in the house now. Padding downstairs in her robe and slippers, Eleanor found evidence of his presence everywhere. His work boots placed neatly by the front door, his rain jacket hanging carefully in the coat closet, coffee already brewing in the kitchen, the machine set up with a precision that spoke of military training and consideration for others. Mason stood at the kitchen window, fully dressed despite the early hour, holding a steaming mug while he watched the snow accumulate on her garden. He turned when he heard her footsteps, offering a small smile that felt like morning sunlight. "Sleep okay?" he asked, pouring coffee into a second mug and adding the splash of cream she preferred. The fact that he'd noticed and remembered such a small detail shouldn't have felt significant, but it did. "Better than I have in years," Eleanor admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The guest bed's more comfortable than my couch," Mason replied with gentle humor. "Though I was up early checking the electrical connections, everything's holding steady." They stood together at the window, watching snow dust the bare branches of her oak trees. Eleanor felt a contentment she couldn't remember experiencing before. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper. The sense of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to be with. "I should probably head out soon," Mason said after a while, though his tone lacked conviction. "Get home before the roads get too slick." Eleanor nodded, understanding the practical necessity while feeling her chest tighten with something that might have been panic. "Of course, though if you need to come back this week for anything else, ... She let the sentence hang unfinished, afraid to sound too eager, too desperate for his continued presence. Mason set down his coffee mug and turned to face her fully, his expression thoughtful. "The wall repair in your study still needs finishing," he said carefully. "Probably take me a few days to get it right. No rush," Eleanor replied quickly, the words carrying weight that had nothing to do with home improvement projects. She wasn't talking about the wall, and they both knew it. Mason's mouth curved into something approaching a smile. "Good. I like to take my time with important work." The conversation felt like a dance, both of them circling around the real discussion they needed to have. Eleanor refilled her coffee, using the mundane task to gather courage for honesty. "Mason," she began, then stopped, the familiar paralysis of overthinking threatening to steal her words. "I'm listening," he said simply, leaning against the counter with patient attention. "I don't know what this is." Eleanor gestured between them, encompassing the comfortable domesticity of sharing morning coffee, the easy way they'd navigated the previous evening, the sense of rightness that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I just know I don't want it to end." Mason was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same careful attention he brought to diagnosing electrical problems. "What do you want it to be?" The question was both simple and impossibly complex. Eleanor had spent so many years defining herself by what she was supposed to want: the right husband, the right social circle, the right way to present herself to the world. But standing in her kitchen with this man who saw her clearly and chose to stay anyway, she found herself reaching for something more honest. "I want it to be real," she said finally. "Whatever that looks like, however it develops, I want it to be genuine instead of performed." Mason nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "Real means messy sometimes. Means we both show up as we actually are, not as we think we should be." "I'm tired of pretending to be someone else," Eleanor admitted. "It's exhausting and lonely, and it doesn't even work very well." "Then stop," Mason said, echoing his advice from their dinner conversation. "Stop pretending. Stop performing. Just be Eleanor." The simplicity of the suggestion was revolutionary. Eleanor had been playing roles for so long that she'd almost forgotten the person underneath all the careful construction. But sitting here with Mason, sharing coffee and quiet conversation while snow fell outside. She caught glimpses of who that person might be. "Will you still want to know her?" Eleanor asked, vulnerability making her voice smaller. The real Eleanor, without all the polish and presentation. Mason stepped closer, reaching out to touch her hand briefly, not possessive or romantic, just reassuring. "I'm looking forward to meeting her." Call to action. What happens when two people choose authenticity over performance? Eleanor and Mason are about to discover that real connection requires more courage than either of them imagined. Their journey toward genuine intimacy will challenge everything they thought they knew about love, trust, and the courage to be seen. Chapter 11. The letter word count. 800 words. Eleanor sat at her mahogany desk in the study, staring at the blank sheet of cream-colored stationery that had been her mother's. The kind with her initials embossed in subtle gold at the top. She'd written hundreds of letters on this paper over the years, thank you notes for charity events, condolences for acquaintances' losses, carefully worded responses to social obligations that required just the right tone of gracious participation. This letter felt different. Revolutionary even. The wall behind her showed Mason's meticulous work from the previous day, perfectly patched drywall where water damage had left ugly stains. Primer applied with the kind of attention to detail that transformed repair into craftsmanship. He'd worked quietly while she handled phone calls and correspondence, their comfortable coexistence feeling like the most natural thing in the world. She picked up her fountain pen, the weight of it familiar in her fingers, and began to write. "Dear Carolyn, I've been thinking about our last conversation, about the things we said and didn't say, about the choices we make and the lives we build. I realized I owe you an explanation for my behavior lately, though I'm not sure it's one you'll understand or approve of." Eleanor paused, considering her next words carefully. Carolyn had always been her closest confidant, the sister who understood the rules of their social circle and played the game with effortless skill. But the game felt meaningless now, like elaborate performance art that no one actually enjoyed. "I've met someone who sees me differently than I've ever been seen before. Not as Richard's widow or our parents' daughter or the woman who chairs the hospital auxiliary. He sees me as Eleanor, just Eleanor, with all my flaws and fears and capacity for both cruelty and kindness. I know what you're thinking. I can hear your voice in my head, all the reasonable objections and social concerns. But Caroline, I'm 58 years old, and I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations of what's appropriate or proper or safe." The words flowed more easily now, as if years of careful diplomacy were finally giving way to honest expression. Eleanor found herself writing about loneliness, about the suffocating weight of maintaining appearances, about discovering that connection could exist without performance. "He's teaching me that dignity comes from how you treat people, not from what they can do for your reputation. That kindness matters more than sophistication. That showing up authentically is braver than showing up perfectly. I'm not asking for your approval or your understanding. I'm simply telling you that I'm choosing to live differently now, to value substance over surface, to judge people by their character rather than their credentials." Eleanor set down her pen, reading over what she'd written. There was more she could say about Mason specifically, about the way he'd patiently endured her initial cruelty and responded with grace, about how his quiet presence had become the most important part of her days. But those details felt too precious to share, too intimate for even Caroline's scrutiny. Instead, she added a final paragraph. "I hope you can support this change in me, but I understand if you can't. Either way, I won't be returning to the charity board or attending the social functions that no longer bring me joy. I'm building something real now, something that doesn't require constant maintenance or performance. I love you, but I love myself enough now to stop living for other people's comfort." Eleanor sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself, addressing the envelope in her careful script. The local post office would handle delivery, but Eleanor knew the real work was already done. She'd drawn a line between her old life and whatever came next, choosing honesty over harmony for perhaps the first time in her adult life. Mason appeared in the study doorway as she was stamping the envelope, tool bag in hand, for another day of patient restoration work. He noticed the letter immediately, reading something in her posture that made him pause. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle concern that had become familiar and precious. "Better than okay," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I just chose myself over everyone else's opinion of what my life should look like." Mason nodded, understanding without needing explanation. "How does it feel?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotions. She felt lighter, as if she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't realized was there. Free, but also slightly terrified by the vast open space that freedom created. "Scary," she admitted, "and wonderful." "Good, scary, or bad scary?" Mason asked, settling his tool bag by the door and giving her his full attention. "Good scary," Eleanor said, standing and moving toward him with more confidence than she'd felt in years. "The kind that means you're finally living instead of just surviving." Mason smiled, the expression transforming his face with warmth and pride. "Then you're exactly where you need to be." 3 days later, Caroline's response arrived, a brief note expressing disappointment and concern for Eleanor's impulsive decisions. Eleanor read it once, felt a pang of sadness for the distance growing between them, then filed it away without answering. She had more important things to focus on now. Real things. True things. Things that mattered more than maintaining relationships, built on mutual performance rather than genuine affection. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt free. The chandelier cast perfect light across Eleanor's dining room, each crystal catching and refracting the warm glow into dancing patterns on the walls. Mason stood beneath it, making final adjustments. 2 connections that had been temperamental for months. Steady hands bringing order to chaos with the same patient precision he applied to everything else. Eleanor watched from the doorway, no longer pretending she had urgent business elsewhere when he worked. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, since her letter to Caroline, since she'd chosen authenticity over performance, and the transformation felt both gradual and revolutionary. "That should do it," Mason said, climbing down from the stepladder and packing his tools with practiced efficiency. "Good as new, maybe better." The light above them glowed steadily, no flicker or hesitation in its brilliance. Eleanor had always taken the chandelier for granted, treating it as merely decorative, but now she understood it as something more symbolic. Mason had restored not just its function, but its purpose, to illuminate rather than simply impress. "Tea," Eleanor offered, the question part of a rhythm they'd developed over recent weeks. He would finish whatever repair or improvement project had brought him to her house. She would offer refreshment, and they would sit together in her kitchen or garden, talking about everything and nothing until the afternoon dissolved into evening. But today felt different, final. Somehow Mason accepted the tea, settling into what had become his usual chair at her kitchen table. Eleanor prepared the cups with the same care she brought to everything involving him, now attention to details that mattered because the person mattered. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the late afternoon sun slanting through her windows and casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the anxiety that came with approaching conversations she didn't know how to navigate. "So," Mason said finally, his voice gentle but direct, "what happens now?" The question she'd been avoiding, the one that had been hanging unspoken between them for days. Eleanor had been so focused on the process of change, on becoming someone more genuine, that she hadn't fully considered what came after transformation. "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I've never been in a situation quite like this." Mason smiled, the expression carrying warmth and understanding. "Neither have I. I keep thinking I should have." "A plan," Eleanor continued, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup nervously. "Some clear vision of what I want or expect or need from you, from this, from whatever we're building together." "And do you," Mason asked, "have a plan?" Eleanor laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "No. For the first time in my adult life, I'm completely without a strategy or agenda. It should terrify me, but somehow it feels like the most honest place I've ever been." Mason reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers in the gentle, undemanding way that had become familiar between them. "Maybe that's exactly where you need to be." The touch was electric and comforting simultaneously. grounding Eleanor in the present moment while opening up possibilities she'd never imagined for herself. She turned her hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine properly for the first time. "I don't want you to leave," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than any declaration of love. "Not just tonight, not just until the next repair project. I don't want you to leave." Mason's thumb traced across her knuckles, his touch reverent and careful. "I don't want to leave either." The admission hung between them, simple and profound. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally speaking her deepest truth to someone who received it without judgment or conditions. "What does that look like?" she asked, practical concerns threading through emotional revelation. "I mean, logistically, socially, all the details that matter in real life." "However we want it to look," Mason replied, his voice steady and sure. "We're both adults, Eleanor. We both know what we want and what we don't want. We figure it out together, one day at a time." Eleanor nodded, the simplicity of his approach both foreign and appealing after years of overcomplicating every decision. "I'm going to disappoint people. Carolyn, the charity boards, the social circle that expects certain things from women like me. Are you okay with that?" Mason asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "I'd rather disappoint them than disappoint myself again." Mason lifted their joined hands, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise and a benediction combined. "Then we're going to be just fine." The chandelier above their heads continued its steady glow, illuminating not just the room, but the beginning of something unprecedented and precious. Eleanor looked at Mason, really looked at him. This man who had seen past her defenses and chosen to stay anyway on felt the last of her fear dissolve into anticipation. "Now I don't ask you to stay," she said softly, echoing words she'd practiced but never spoken. "I just hope you will." Mason's answer was wordless but complete. He squeezed her hand, smiled with his entire being, and settled more deeply into his chair, as if preparing for a very long, very wonderful conversation. He was staying. They both were. The light stayed on.